NATO leaders have this week been meeting in London to mark the 70th anniversary of an organisation that styles itself as the most successful military alliance in history. However, provocative claims from French President Emmanuel Macron that NATO is, as he put it, brain dead, triggered an angry reaction from others, not least from US President Donald Trump, who described the comment as nasty, insulting and disrespectful. For her part, Angela Merkel, as usual, worked to seek some sort of compromise and consensus, concluding that it had been a very successful meeting. So our question here on To The Point is, NATO at 70 brain dead or fighting fit? Well, thanks so much for joining us here on To The Point, here in the studio in Berlin. And I'm joined by three excellent journalists, beginning with my Deutsche Welle colleague, Emmanuelle Chaze, who's a French-born political correspondent. And Emmanuelle says, gloves off, Macron's brain-dead comments on NATO put diplomacy at risk. Also with us is Vladimir Esipov from the Russian desk here at DW. He believes that NATO is the perfect enemy for Russia. If NATO didn't exist, then for domestic purposes, the Kremlin would have to invent it. And a very warm welcome too to Malte Lehming. He's an author and senior editor at the Berlin-based daily Der Tagesspiegel. And he argues that NATO is still the strongest military alliance in the world. The infighting at the London summit shows just how complex many security challenges have become. Malte, I would like to begin with you. Ahead of the London gathering, one UK newspaper, The Guardian newspaper, said the meeting had the potential to be, and I'm quoting, the birthday party from hell. There were certainly fears that things could get very ugly. So now that the dust has settled, is NATO more united or less united than before?
I think it is more united than before because we saw some surprises. Strong commitment from the US President Donald Trump to NATO, strongly rejecting all brain-dead comments by the French President. No pulling out from Erdogan, no obstruction from any other participant that was feared about. So there were infights and struggles, yes, but I think the unity in the alliance has been strengthened.
The unity. So it's interesting, though, Malte, the German headlines that I was looking at earlier said that after the summit closed, there had been no uproar, no disaster, no bust-up. It all sounds pretty paltry for an organisation that, as we say, sees itself as the greatest military alliance in history.
You're right. It is a defensive position, saying there was no, split up of all these. But giving the different kind of threats we're facing, starting from Russia to China, cyber war, and all these things, you name it. It was not supposed to be a meeting. It's not even called a summit. It's called a meeting with no clear-cut agenda anyway. So it was not supposed to solve these problems or get a unanimous position about new threats and things like this, even though they found a final pamphlet about topics they agreed upon.
Emmanuelle, you are nodding vigorously.
I am. Well, actually, I think there was some sort of an agenda during that meeting. There was a set of decisions that people had agreed upon before even the meeting. The defense and foreign ministers had agreed upon certain things that, and the outcome was that London Declaration that was made at the summit. I think that was important for them to meet at this occasion of that 70th anniversary to reiterate and reassess as well this alliance.
And while all that was going on, there was a very interesting, what you might call, role reversal between Presidents Trump and Macron, with Macron lashing out at NATO and Donald Trump saying that he's a fan of the NATO alliance and that NATO has come a long way in the last 3 years. What do you make of all that?
Well, that's a bit rich coming from Trump to actually blast someone over very sensitive comments, I would say. But also,
is your French pride hurt?
It's not necessarily the French pride, because I also don't necessarily agree with the way Emmanuel Macron actually addressed NATO. I think I get the point that he wants things to be shifting within the alliance, and that's fair enough. I think it needs some shifting, but calling it brain dead at such a sensitive time where we're having so many geopolitical issues, I think that's not necessarily the right way to go. And also, it also goes on to show that he's resorting to strategies that are President Trump's strategies.
But he says that he has achieved a lot using this blunt language.
He's adopting Trump's strategies, and actually, when Donald Trump actually shook up NATO last year, it resulted in countries to actually put more money into their defense politics. So maybe it needs some kind of shaken up. I'm just not sure that not using diplomacy to achieve so is very wise given the current political situation globally.
Mm-hmm. Vladimir Esipov, though, what are people in Russia likely to have thought or to think? What would their emotional reaction be to seeing NATO celebrating its 70th anniversary?
There was much talk about celebration in the Russian state media. If you look what Russian media covering from London, it's very cynical comments about NATO being busy with itself, about states of the chief of the states, presidents and prime ministers gossiping about each other.
So
a
decadent gathering
about this, about that. And it was the first topic, and the second one was NATO lacking money to compete with the beautiful Russian rocket systems and with the new beautiful Russian weapon systems. So basically, it's quite cynical views in Russia on this.
Are people in Russia frightened of NATO in the way that people in Europe are frightened of Russia?
Not at all. I mean, Russia is so proud on its military. Right today, is a new Russian film appearing in the Russian cinemas about another one, Battle of the Second World War in Russia, which is a huge production, which is supporting the Russian national pride and the military history again. So there is no such thing as a Russian being frightened.
And I think the Russians know that NATO is not a annexing and conquering an imperialistic power. So they know the difference between the one or the other.
No one really cares. If you talk to the normal average people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, I mean, no one really cares. NATO, this danger from NATO is instrumentalized to the domestic political goals for consolidation of society, for some domestic issues, but it's not such fear in the broad population like in Europe.
But it was interesting, nevertheless, to hear Vladimir Putin talking from Sochi, from the Black Sea resorts, talking about NATO's continued expansion, as he put it, and then nevertheless saying that he hoped that a shared interest in common security would prevail. Is that, Malte, a first step perhaps in a new direction? Some people are hoping that it is. A dialogue, a different kind of dialogue, a different kind of conversation.
I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, Macron raised the topic of new relationships with Russia, but I'm afraid it won't happen very soon. There are just too many developments. I mean, still the annexation of the Crimean, the war is still going on in east of Ukraine. We will have the Normandy meeting on Monday coming up in Paris. We will see if that leads to something, but we have the new...
It's being viewed as a litmus test for possible new relations. And, I mean, you know... Yeah. Can it work?
But given the recent...
Will we get progress on Ukraine?
I hope.
Excuse me, but given the recent scandal in Berlin with the likelihood that the Russians are involved
in the recent
killing.
Scandal for our viewers.
A man was killed in Berlin in Tiergarten, supposedly, and many indices point to that, with the involvement of the Russian Secret Service. The perpetrator was caught, but he's silent about it, and 2 diplomats were expelled in Germany. So there are huge tensions right now.
And how is that likely to impact the Ukraine meeting on Monday, this coming Monday?
It will impact the meeting in terms of, is this the right time to make new kind of policy towards Vladimir Putin? And I think no German politician right now can say, yes, it is the right time.
Okay.
But still Angela Merkel going to Paris to meet Vladimir Putin, and who knoes how the thing will turn out on Monday.
They will
Paris. And I hope there will be some concrete steps towards de-escalations in the eastern Ukraine. I hope as in the Russian. I don't know what's happening in Paris next week, but I
Yes,
hope.
yes. I
Okay.
mean, de-escalation in East Ukraine, yes, things like that, but no new, strategic partnership in any kind of terms.
There's no talks about new strategic partnership towards Russia. There's talks about concrete de-escalation step in Normandy format, about Minsk agreement with de-escalation in the eastern Ukraine, and I hope there will be concrete steps in this direction.
Okay. The debate about NATO's goals and purpose goes back a long way, right to the very beginning, in fact. But so far, nobody has described the alliance as brain dead. And there's little debating the fact that militarily, NATO is a force to be reckoned with.
Last year, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization flexed its muscles in Norway. It was the biggest military exercise since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and a show of resolve directed at Russia. Before the summit, French President Emmanuel Macron made it clear that he desired an end to the confrontation with Moscow and a new definition of NATO's aims.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Who is our common enemy? What are our common topics? This question deserves clarification, and as you see, it's a very strategic question. Sometimes I hear, is Russia our enemy? Is it China? Is it the mission of the Transatlantic Alliance to designate them as enemies? I don't believe so. Our common enemy within the alliance is the terrorism that has hit every one of our countries.
With that, President Macron has set the direction of the NATO summit and rebuffed alliance partners, especially in Eastern Europe. In addition, he criticized more severely than any other so far the unilateral American withdrawal from Syria and the actions of NATO partner Turkey in the region. Has Macron driven a wedge into NATO?
It's an interesting question, Emmanuelle. Is President Macron putting the future cohesion of NATO at stake, at risk? He certainly, he's arguing that it's all very good spending a lot of money on the military. It's all very good having boots on the ground and being efficient militarily, but you need to have strategic goals. And the central strategic goal, as we just saw, is the question, who is the enemy? What's the answer?
Well, here we saw a very diplomatic Emmanuel Macron saying that we don't have enemies. We need to actually negotiate with them and not consider them as enemies. It's all very good, but also we see that 29 countries form NATO, and they all have diverging interests in terms of defense. Most of them don't spend enough, according to NATO regulation, on their defense budget. So yes, there needs to be a new strategy. There also needs to be an identifying of the actual threats. We have new zones of conflicts that are to be identified.
I mean, the current threat, the threat at the moment.
The threat is not necessarily one country or another. The threat is much more global. This year, at this meeting, NATO acknowledged that China was posing new opportunities, but also new challenges with its rise. And of course, the situation with Russia at the moment poses a threat when it comes to melding with elections. Vladimir will probably be able to say more about it than me. Emmanuel Macron just outlines the fact that we need a new strategy for NATO, and that's what I was saying earlier, by just saying that the organization is branded is not going to bring things much further.
Vladimir, who is the enemy?
What is if the enemy is not a country? What is if the enemy is climate change or globalization or global poverty?
Not mentioned at the gathering in London, as far as I can tell, climate change.
What is if the enemy cannot be fought with weapons? What if the enemy is operating on the level of mass media, of fake news, of manipulation of the public opinion? Has the NATO...
This sounds a little bit more like Russia now.
What has the NATO right answers to these dangers coming from, not from the country, not on the convenient way, with panzer, with tanks,
yeah.
and with
old style, old school.
Convenient weapons?
But let's go back in history a little bit. I mean, we had the bipolar world, the Cold War. There was a clear-cut enemy, and that was Soviet Union.
And it's gone.
After the wall came down, there was a term coined in the Cold War called flexible response. It was how to react in kind of war towards Soviet Union troops. If you have a flexible response, you need a flexible response today about new threats. There is no single biggest threat, but that doesn't mean that there are not multipolar threats as, for example, Russia or China or cyber war or terrorism.
Or the threat from within, that NATO members don't necessarily all share the same values as they did for so long. They don't necessarily share the values that are mapped out in the preamble of the NATO treaty.
Yes, but do they have to share the same values to confront the variety of threats? Maybe not. Maybe they can confront the variety of threats with different kind of values. I mean, clear-cut example is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who clearly has different kind of values than the rest of NATO.
Before we continue, I'd like to come back to you on Mr. Erdogan. Let's just go to a clip that we have of the way that President Erdogan addressed the meeting in London, the agenda, the very robust agenda he brought with him that some people have dismissed as blackmail. Let's listen.
If our friends at NATO do not recognize as a terrorist organization those against whom we are carrying out our fight against terrorism, then, excuse me, we will oppose any step that NATO seeks to undertake.
Malte, we were talking about shared values or values that are not necessarily shared. Your newspaper, the Tagesspiegel, writes Turkey regularly behaves as if it couldn't care less about the shared values and interests that underpin the alliance.
Yes, but it still might be a valued member of the alliance. Even though we have the disputes about the S-400 defense system, the Russian defense system, we have disputes about Syria, about the cooperation with Russia in that region, about supporting Islamists in Syria, and so on and so on, and not to talk about everything that is inside Turkey, which gives reason for a lot of worries. Mm-hmm. So, but it still is a very valuable member of the alliance in the south flank.
Well, every member of NATO is valuable because they all have an equal say in the matter. So there's no country that is less than the other, and I think that's one of the things that still makes NATO valuable today.
People are worried about Turkey in the course it's now on. Some are saying Turkey should not be a member of NATO.
Yes, but it is, and it is still.
Realpolitik rules.
It is still, and this meeting in London, I think there was much to say about conflicts of interest and conflicts of personality clashing. We saw Emmanuel Macron talking with Justin Trudeau from Canada, and that gave a bit of the feeling of a schoolyard, and I'm not sure the world at the moment deserves that kind of attitude from our leaders, to be honest.
I would like to get back to the point you mentioned about the past of the NATO, because the whole set of the problems or the whole dangerous sources of danger shifted completely in the recent decades. And as Turkey became the member of the NATO, the danger was completely different than now. And now it's the Middle East as a hot spot of the world politics. So Turkey plays a completely different role in the whole process. And this is what we are talking about. The whole world is changing so quick and so far and so fast that we need to react, or NATO needs to react very quick to this. And the question is NATO able to react that quick to the new dangers?
And that's what
I could remind you about there is the 30-30-30 initiative, and I think it's very valuable. I might explore it a little bit. It means NATO has to be able in 30 days to have 30 battalions, 30 ships, and 30 air wings in every corner on the earth. So if they work on these initiatives, I think it's very valuable, and it might confront a lot of threats they are facing.
But I think we're also facing new threats. For example, the cyberspace, NATO has to become performant in fighting that. There's also a new place of conflict that is actual space, and it also has to develop tools in that regard. I think the threats have diversified, and if NATO wants to survive, it actually has to find a way to address those.
Exactly. If I set up 2 Facebook groups from St. Petersburg Trollfabrik, and to push ideas via Facebook to the American public and keep fighting through these Facebook groups, American public, one part of the American public against another part of American public, what can ships and tanks do against this? This is the question.
Let's talk just for a second, because I would like to, and I want to hear what Emmanuelle has to say about one point that we haven't touched so far. There's a lot of tension in NATO ranks about money. A significant number of NATO members, according to Donald Trump, are freeloading, including Germany.
We were paying 4 to 4.3% of the largest GDP ever. Nobody's ever had a GDP like we have right now, and nobody's come close. And other people were paying 1%. Some people were paying less than 1% of a very small GDP. It's not fair. And if they get attacked, we protect them, but it's not fair.
Emmanuelle, with your French background, do you understand Germany's reluctance to meet spending targets?
Well, it has a history as well. Because of World War II, Germany was reluctant for a long time to allow military spending at all. And this side of history is still very present in every decision made in regarding to
the result of what you're
defense.
saying is that there are French troops on the ground fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting IS
yes,
in
that was
the,
my second,
in the Sahel region, and Germany is twiddling its thumbs.
That was my second. That was my second point, actually. So Germany spends way less than France in its defense, and France is actually paying the price of blood in Africa in order to protect the rest of Europe. That is a fact, and indeed that is problematic. It is also problematic in the partnership between France and Germany, because they agreed no later than in October, they did agree to spend less on a coordinated defense system. But Germany, the German parliament, is spending too much time discussing the budgets rather than putting the money where it should be, and that actually hinders the French-German relationship as well.
Vladimir, what's your response to this deep streak of pacifism that still is very central in German politics, military politics and life?
If I talk to my Russian friends visiting St. Petersburg and Moscow, and if I tell them what German media writing and covering about the condition of the Bundeswehr, no one believes me.
Where Bundeswehr troops are sent out into the field without weaponry fit for purpose.
So little helicopters, so little submarines, basically nothing. Unimaginable for people living in Russia, for a country like Germany having this kind of army.
Malte, I can hear you trying to get in.
Yes, I'd say Germany should spend more. They should spend more, not necessarily on hardware, even though I think the army has to be modernized very, very much. But they should spend more on cyber defense. This is one of the huge topics NATO countries have to face as a security threat. And to develop and build up the needed skills for cyber defense is something that is really, really important. And I think you might even get a majority of Germans committed to that, not necessarily to defense spending the traditional way. But let me add one more point to US President Donald Trump's claim. I mean, you still have to see the United States spend like $5 trillion from 9/11 to now on the war on terror all over the world. So the huge defense budget of the United States goes to many places in the world, not just to European defense.
But there's another one point which no one in Russia really understands about Germany, this high-speed internet connection. If you talk about cyber attacks and cyber defense, no one really can imagine that the country like Germany can have such a bad quality of internet.
But there will always be a discrepancy between the American army and the German or European army in the making, for example, because we simply do not share the same vision of the world. Simply said, I mean, Germany, because of history, will never be a country which will want to expand, which will want to intervene with its army, but at least it should have a functioning army. And the fact that regularly Angela Merkel cannot fly somewhere because the plane wouldn't take off or something like that, that goes on to show...
it's a crying shame.
It is.
Malte.
Yes, it is a crying shame, and it's not just Merkel, it's the president as well, it's the foreign minister and many other, because just the planes don't fly. And I think this is, for a country like, I agree with Esipov, quite a lot of this, and I think not just Russians are laughing about this, but the rest of the world is doing that as well.
But especially the Russians and the Chinese, who are developing a terrestrial army and an aerial float.
But if we come to the Chinese, I mean, China was mentioned at the meeting in London as well.
So little time.
And so there you overlap a new threat in cyber war with traditional threats, and it is called Huawei, the firm that makes up the 5G system and that is supposed to do it in Germany.
We've got to wrap up. The most successful military alliance in history, was the claim ever justified? Is it hubris or is it a fact?
Fact.
Still a fact.
I agree completely.
We're all in agreement on that one. Thank you very, very much for joining us here on To The Point today. Brain dead or fighting fit? NATO at 70. That's been the question we've been addressing. I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought. If we have, come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.